everyone! So last video we talked about standardizing arguments, identifying the conclusion, and then writing all the premises sort of in a listed order after them. This is a useful tool, it's a useful starting point, but there's limitations to what a standardization can tell us about how the pieces of an argument fit together. To learn a little bit more, we're going to need to use a slightly stronger tool than standardizing. We're going to use what's called the argument diagramming. This is the material that's covered in the appendix to the logic textbook. So that's what we'll cover in this video. All right, let's get started. All right, so when I say that diagramming arguments is a slightly more powerful tool than standardizing them, what I mean by that is that when we diagram an argument, we can tell how the various parts of an argument fit together. In particular, how do the premises relate to one another, and how do the premises then relate to the conclusion. This is going to be especially important when we're looking at more complicated arguments. Because more complicated arguments are going to need more sophisticated ways of evaluating, we're going to need to really understand how the pieces of the more complicated argument fit together. So let's look at a simple example first. So, Kara is a mammal because Kara is a cat, and all cats are mammals. We saw in the last video that we would standardize this argument with the conclusion, Kara is a mammal, placed on the bottom, and the two premises, Kara is a cat and all cats are mammals, listed above it. Once you have your standardization, now it's time to do the argument diagram. The first step of the argument diagram is to take the conclusion that was identified in the course of standardizing the argument and place it at the top of your diagram. In more complicated arguments, precisely what to do with the premises could be a little bit more complicated, but this is a pretty straightforward and simple example, as we'll see in a second, so we can for now just take the two premises and put them underneath the conclusion. The remaining thing we have to figure out before our diagram is complete is how are the two premises related to one another, and how are they related to the conclusion. There's two different options, in effect, for how premises can relate to one another and how they can relate to the conclusion. So premises can support the conclusion via what's called independent support, or via linked support. It also gets sometimes called joint support. Those two names mean pretty much what they sound like. In independent support, the premise works independently to give you reasons to believe that the conclusion is true. In linked support, the premise has to work together or be linked together with another premise in order to support the conclusion. To test and see which is going on within a given argument, a good trick to use is to actually just see if the argument would make any sense if we just treated each premise individually. So in the case of this argument, let's say we had just one, Kara is a cat, conclusion, therefore Kara is a mammal. And then similarly with the second premise, one, all cats are mammals, conclusion, Kara is a mammal. Do either of these arguments make sense on their own? Are they intelligible? Does the premises really give us any reason to believe that the conclusion is true? And the claim that I'm going to make is actually, no, neither of these really make sense on their own. In the first case, we don't know that all cats are mammals. At least we're not told by the argument that all cats are mammals. Now, you all probably know that, right? You're smuggling it in, but you're smuggling it in as a premise. The simple fact that Kara is a cat doesn't tell us anything at all about that Kara is a mammal unless we have some way of connecting the idea of cats to the idea of mammals. Similarly, in the second case, if all cats are mammals and Kara is a mammal, again, that doesn't really tell us anything because we don't have any reason to believe that Kara is a cat. The two premises only really make sense when they work together. Each gives one part of the conclusion. The first premise gives the Kara part of the conclusion, and the second gives the mammal part of the conclusion. Those two things taken together gives us the entire conclusion, so this is going to be an example of what gets called linked support. The way you show that in your diagram is by bracketing the two premises, and then drawing one single arrow up from what you bracketed up to the conclusion. What that means is that both premises have to be true for the argument to possibly work, if it otherwise would be a successful argument. If Kara is actually the name of my dog and not the name of my cat, then the argument is worthless. The argument's not going to give us any reason to believe that the conclusion is true, because the two premises only give us a reason to think that the conclusion is true if both of them are right, if both of them work together. Let's look at another simple example. Again, this is from the previous video. I studied hard for the test. I did all of the homework. I've done well in all the previous tests. So I will probably do well in this test too. Again, we saw with the previous video that we can standardize this argument, pick out the conclusion, which is in this case the last sentence, put it at the bottom, and then list the next premises in order. So for diagramming, we treat it the same way. Again, this is a simple argument. You'll have a little bit more to do when it's more complicated, but for a simple argument like this one, again, you just put the conclusion on the top, you put the premises underneath. So the question becomes, what kind of support do these premises have for the conclusion? And the choices are various. They could be linked, it could be all independent, or there could be a mix. One of them could be independent, two of them could be linked. So the number of premises really doesn't tell you much of anything. The only hint, if you only ever have one premise, yeah, you know then you're looking at independent support because there's nothing for that one premise to link to. But otherwise, you have any number of options. So let's figure out what kind of relationship are we seeing amongst these premises? How are they related to the conclusion? And if we do what we did last time, divide each premise into its own individual argument, I studied hard for the test, I will probably do well on the test. That makes sense. Similarly, I did all the homework, I'll do well on the test. Again, I think that makes sense. That's a reason to think that you'll do well on the test. I did well in the previous tests, therefore I'll probably do well on this test. Again, that makes sense, right? Each of these premises gives you some reason to believe that the conclusion is true. Now, if you treat all three of them together, as happens in the argument, you have a stronger argument, certainly. The conclusion is sort of more likely to be true if all three of these things are the case. But each one does give you some reason to believe that the conclusion is true, and so therefore they're independent support. The way you'll diagram independent support is just by now drawing an individual arrow from each premise up to the conclusion. And what it means to say that this argument is using independent support is that each premise gives you some reason to believe that the conclusion is true on its own, and that the argument would still have some relevance, would give you some reason to believe that the conclusion is true, even if one of the premises turned out to be false. So say, for example, that I didn't do well on my previous test. The argument is certainly now weaker than it otherwise would be, right? It's less likely that the conclusion is true, but the argument still does give you some reasons to think that the conclusion will still be true, that I'll still do well on the test, mainly the other premises. Alright, let's look at a more complicated argument now, and this is where we'll really see the value of argument diagramming. So let's take the argument we looked at previously, and add one sentence at the end of it. So it's the same argument, we've added a new sentence. As a result, I can afford to go to a party tonight, despite having a test tomorrow. Alright, so before we even start working about the diagramming, let's just do the standardizing step. What actually is the conclusion within this argument? It seems like we have two candidates, and for this we can use various different methods. For this we can just look at conclusion keywords. So, in the fourth sentence, that's a conclusion keyword that indicates that what follows is likely to be some kind of conclusion. And similarly with as a result, that also is a clue word that indicates what follows is likely to be some kind of conclusion. But every argument only has one conclusion, or what we're going to call as a primary conclusion. And so we can't say that they're both the conclusion of the argument. That doesn't work. So which one is actually the conclusion? Which of these two choices? We know from looking at the previous problems that the first three sentences do indeed give you reasons to believe that the fourth sentence is true. So maybe we should still think that the fourth sentence is true. The conclusion of this argument is that I will probably do well on this test. Alright, but if that's the case, then we should expect that the fifth sentence will also give us some reason to believe that I'll do well in the test, and that doesn't seem to be what actually happens here. I can afford to go to the party, so I'll do well in the test. That doesn't make a great deal of sense. The opposite actually seems to make a great deal of more sense. I can afford to go to the party because I am likely to do well on the test. So that suggests that 5 is the conclusion, that 4 actually is sort of pointing to 5, 5's not pointing to 4. What that means is that 4 is part of what we're going to call a subordinate argument contained within the larger argument. So a subordinate argument is when some of the premises within an argument give you reasons to believe that other premises are true, instead of them giving you reasons to believe that the conclusion itself is true. So let's just define our terms here. So subordinate premises are premises that support other premises rather than the conclusion directly. A subordinate conclusion are any premises that get supported by subordinate premises. And then finally, the primary premises are premises that support the conclusion directly. You can call it the primary conclusion if you want, but the main conclusion, the conclusion of the actual argument. So in this case, let's look at our standardization then. We've said that our main conclusion is the fifth sentence, so that'll go in the bottom. Then for the purposes of the standardization, we'll just list the premises as we see them in order. I studied, I did all the homework, I've done well in the previous exams, and I'll probably do well in this exam. They're all premises insofar as they're not the main conclusion, basically. We'll say those first three are subordinate premises. 4 is the subordinate conclusion. It's also the primary premise that gives support to the actual conclusion that I can afford to go to the party tonight. So the way we'll diagram this, the primary conclusion still goes on top. The subordinate conclusion will go underneath, also because it's a primary premise, right? Well, it's an independent support. That premise by itself gives you a reason to believe that the conclusion is true. So we'll draw a direct arrow from 4 up to the conclusion. And then just like we did in the previous simpler case, we'll say premises 1, 2, and 3, they give you independent reasons to believe that premise number 4 is true. They're subordinate premises. And so draw it by drawing an individual arrow from each of them up to the conclusion. Alright, that'll do it for this video for today. This argument diagramming is probably the first thing that most people are going to find challenging, at least that's been my experience. So this is a good place for make sure you're keeping up with the homework assignments, make sure you're paying attention in class. We're going to do a lot of practice with this argument diagramming in class this week so that people can get really good, really confident with diagramming. It's a really important skill. People who sort of do well with diagramming and to sort of like put in the work and to get good at it tend to find the rest of the class a lot easier. It just really helps when you can sort of understand how the arguments work, how their parts fit together. So this is going to be a super important skill. We'll try to really hit it hard in class. Also, don't forget, I've got office hours you can always come to too. All right, so I will see you in the class sessions, and I will talk to you later. Bye.